Hello, in this video, we will look at the concept of deconstruction in some detail. Deconstruction is it is a very important concept in post-structuralist critical theory. In the previous video, we had looked at a very brief introduction to post-structuralism. Here, we will look at deconstruction in a bit more detail. Sometimes people use deconstruction and post-structuralism in an interchangeable way, but there are some small differences as well. Deconstruction is a form of philosophical and literary analysis derived mainly from work begun in the 1960s by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida that questions the fundamental conceptual distinctions or oppositions in Western philosophy through a close examination of the language and logic of philosophical and literary texts. This is a definition of deconstruction given by the Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, let us see what this means in detail. So, first of all, deconstruction as a concept was introduced by Jacques Derrida, who was a French philosopher, and it is based on questioning the binary oppositions that have characterized Western philosophical thought thus far. So, Western philosophical thought has been built on binary oppositions. When you studied structuralism, you would have studied that binary oppositions are an important part of structuralist thought. So, structuralism just points out that Western philosophical thought has been built on binary oppositions, but deconstruction and post-structuralism seek to take that analysis of structuralism forward and completely question and dismantle these binary oppositions. So, what are some of these binary oppositions? Nature, culture, man, woman, speech, writing, absence, presence, etc. These are some of the basic binary oppositions on which Western philosophical thought as well as Western society has been completely built up. All institutions, whether social institutions or conceptual institutions or political institutions, all of them have their foundation is based on these binary oppositions. Now, what Derrida and deconstructivist critics point out is that such oppositions are hierarchically ordered, and one term of the binary is always privileged over the other. So, if you take nature and culture, there is a way in which nature is privileged over culture. When structuralists look at binaries, they say that nature is understood in opposition to culture and culture is understood in opposition to nature. But they don't completely look at the ideologies behind that binary, which take one term of that binary as more important than the other one, which privilege one term over the other. So, nature and culture, for example, the idea is that nature is more natural. It is what pre-exists culture, and therefore there is something much more privileged about nature than about culture. Culture is secondary. It comes from nature. It is derivative, and therefore it is somehow less privileged or less important than nature. Similarly, with man and woman, there is an idea that from the biblical times onwards, there is an idea that man was first created in God's image and woman is derivative of him. Adam was first created and Eve was created from his rib. Right, like that, it is not just in biblical times, even in ancient Greek and Roman times, there was always, Western philosophical thought has always been predicated on this idea. Among many other binary oppositions, this idea of man slash woman has been there, and man has always been privileged over woman. Woman is somehow always seen as secondary in typically biblical sense, even literally derivative, or in many ways as a somehow not as good enough as man. Similarly, with speech and writing, the idea is that speech comes first because speech is very natural. Before we learn to write, we learn to speak. So, speech is somehow very natural to us, and therefore, speech is primary. Writing is a derivative of speech, and therefore, it is secondary. Similarly, absence and presence is a binary where presence is favored or privileged over absence. We will look at this in a bit more detail in the next slide, but let's move on now. So, Western philosophical thought has been built on such binary oppositions, and such oppositions are hierarchically ordered. What deconstruction in philosophy as well as in literature tries to do is to explore the tensions and fault lines in the hierarchical ordering of these binary oppositions in order to demonstrate that this binary is not a fact but rather a construction. So now you can see where this term deconstruction comes from. First, you identify a binary, you identify the privileging of one term over another in the binary, then you show the kind of ideology that is associated with privileging one over the other. Then you probe that binary a bit more and show that this is actually not natural as one thinks. It's not just a fact. Men are not better than women. Nature is not better than culture. All these are basically constructed by us. So you would have heard this term social construction, right? Similarly, this is a construction. We are Western philosophical thought, and that doesn't actually exclude us Indians as well. We have also been subscribing to this Western philosophical thought in some sense. So all these years, people have slowly built up this construction, built up and reinforced this construction which privileges one element of the binary over the other. And once you prove that this is a construction rather than a fact, then what you do is you try to dismantle that construction or deconstruct. Deconstruct doesn't mean destroy. It means you figure out what are the ways in which this construction was put together, and then you take it apart in exactly the same ways to show how it was put together. So many people think that deconstruction is some kind of destruction, that it destroys all the pleasure of reading, etc. But it is important to see that to deconstruct the text doesn't mean to destroy the text, but rather to show how the text was constructed. So you can think about, for example, a set of building blocks using which you have created, Legos or something like that, using which you have created something. So you've created a castle using the building blocks. And if you take those apart, you will see exactly how those pieces were joined together. So that is the idea, and then you can always place it back together. That is not a problem. It's not like you're going to put a bomb and then blow that castle apart, right? No, instead you take apart that toy castle to show exactly how the plastic pieces were put together, and that gives us an idea of how construction happens. So deconstruction is like taking the text apart, just like you would take apart a castle made of Legos or building blocks. Now, deconstruction in philosophy. Deconstruction is used both in philosophy and in literature. It was first used in philosophy by Derrida, who was a philosopher himself, and later it became applied to literature and literary criticism. Now here we will look in a bit more detail at these two interconnected binaries of speech slash writing and presence slash absence. As we have already mentioned, in the binary of speech versus writing, speech takes precedence over writing. And this is because people consider that speech is based on presence. That is, both the speaker and the listener are present at the same time. Because of this, we assume that communication is likely to be clearer and there is less chance of miscommunication or misunderstanding. So when I'm speaking to you, I am in front of you and you are in front of me. Of course, it is true that right now I am not in front of you and you're not in front of me. That's different because nowadays with technology, the very concept of presence has changed a lot. So, but let's keep that aside and let us look at traditionally how speech and writing were understood. So, traditionally speaking, when you speak, the speaker and the listener are at the same place. They are listening to each other. They are experiencing each other's presence. Because of that, the communication is likely to be clearer. So if I am actually in front of you and I'm saying something, then you can always ask me any doubt or clarifications and then I will clarify. So there's always a possibility that the speech will be clearer. Thus, traditional Western philosophy considers speech to be primary and writing to be secondary or derivative of speech. This we have already mentioned. However, Derrida points out that spoken words function as linguistic signs only so far as they have characteristics that are usually associated with writing. That means that even spoken words, if they have to function as linguistic signs, if they have to convey meaning to anybody in any context, then they have to be able to be repeated in the absence of the speaker and also in different contexts, not just the context in which that speaker is speaking. So if I am looking at you and saying, come in, right now it seems like it is speech, there is presence, and I'm telling you to come in to the class or wherever. But come in will make sense to you only if you have heard the words come in somewhere else. So that means somebody else has already said come in to you, or you have said come in to somebody else. And the context is different. Maybe your mother told you to come into the kitchen or to some other part of the house, or somebody else told you to, maybe you were waiting for the bus and the conductor said, get in, come in. So the words come in will make sense as linguistic signs only if they can be repeated by anybody in any context and still mean more or less the same thing, which means that those words are being repeated in a context removed from this particular speaker and this particular context, which according to Derrida is a characteristic form of writing. Writing can be taken from one context and taken somewhere else. So then if you look at it that way, then speech also has certain characteristics of writing. And in that sense, some of the characteristics of writings, like the possibility of being misunderstood, can also be accorded to speech. So, for example, let us look at something very simple like reported speech. So, I tell person A to report something to person B, and person A goes and says exactly the same thing that I said, exact quote, all the words in the same order, but still it is not I who's communicating it to person B, but rather it is person A who is mediating between me and person B. So even if the person says exactly the same words, maybe because of their expression, their gestures, their tone, or any other reason, person B may misunderstand my message. So that is possible even in speech, and that is one of the ways in which Derrida points out that this binary between speech and writing, which is based on the binary between presence and absence, is actually just a construction. And the point of deconstructing this binary, whether it is speech writing or presence absence, is not to invert that binary and say that actually writing should be privileged over speech or actually absence should be privileged over presence. No, rather the idea behind this deconstruction is to destabilize the binary itself, to say that, see, look at this binary. It is not as natural as you think. It is not based on any fact, but rather on a certain kind of construction. Why do we do that construction? Maybe we have some reason for that. Maybe it works as a tool, but apart from that, it doesn't have any truth value. It is not factual. It is not natural. That is what deconstruction tries to point out. Now, let us move on to deconstruction in literature. So, all this while we were talking about how deconstruction is applied in philosophical concepts. Now, let us look at how deconstruction is applied in literary criticism by deconstructing literary texts. Deconstruction in literary criticism treats the text as an unstable vehicle of contradictory meanings and hidden ideologies. Poststructural or deconstructive criticism studies the literary text not individually as a self contained work, but as a product whose meaning evolves in relation to other texts and other discourses. What does this mean? First of all, the deconstruction believes that the text does not have one meaning or one set of stable meanings. Even somebody like new critics who do not believe in the fallacy of authorial intention or the fallacy of the reader's response, even they believe that the text is a self-contained unit which can be studied, and all whatever meaning is there in the text can be discovered just by studying that text. So new critics look at the text as a stable unit which has a unified meaning or a unified set of meanings. But deconstruction, on the other hand, says that the text is unstable. There are meanings in the text, but the meanings of that text are all contradictory. There is no one single meaning. If you can find any one meaning in that text, you can also find its opposite or contradictory meaning. And also, the text always has hidden ideologies, and not necessarily just one ideology but several hidden ideologies. So at surface level this text may seem to be saying one thing, but if you study deeper, if you deconstruct that text, then you realize that the text may also be saying something completely opposite to its apparent meaning. The second point is that the text is studied not individually because the text is unstable, because it is not seen as a self-contained work. You don't look at just that text in isolation, but rather you look at that text in relation to other texts, other contexts, other discourses. We will look at this concept of discourse in greater detail later, but right now, what does discourse mean? Discourse means a set of texts. This is a very simplistic description of the term discourse. We will come to it more detail in more detail later. But if you, for example, if you're studying Shakespeare's Hamlet, you don't study only the text of Hamlet. You also do not just look at Shakespeare, his biography, Elizabethan age, the sources, Holinshed and all those other sources that Shakespeare used to write Hamlet. That is the traditional way of looking at Hamlet. But rather, first of all, you study the text Hamlet as just another text in many other texts, including Shakespeare's life, biography, Elizabethan age, his sources, etc. All those things, and Shakespeare's other texts, the texts of other people like Marlowe and whoever else wrote during that time. All these texts are studied not as context for the text that is Shakespeare's Hamlet, but rather each of those texts are given equal importance. And also, if you study Shakespeare's Hamlet, you have to look at the different ways in which Hamlet has been presented on stage from Shakespeare's time to the present. The different ways in which Hamlet has been studied from Shakespeare's time to the present. The different ways in which Hamlet has been adapted into cinema or into any other art form, and so many different things. So all this is part of the discourse around Hamlet. So that way you can also see that the discourse around that particular text is always evolving. It never ends. Literary deconstruction follows the trace of a key ambiguity or blind spot through the text to illuminate hierarchical oppositions it relies on and the fault lines along which it can be undone, while still acknowledging its power and importance in European thought. So, what literary deconstruction does is it takes, for example, a text like Shakespeare's Hamlet, it identifies a key ambiguity or a blind spot or a contradiction in that text, and through studying that text and other texts and discourses around it, deconstruction tries to illuminate the hierarchical oppositions. We talked about binary oppositions and the hierarchies created by certain ideologies in those oppositions. So, which particular binary opposition is fundamental to this text? What is the hierarchy that that opposition relies on, or what is the ideology behind it? And how can we see the contradiction in this binary opposition? What are the fault lines? What are the fractures or the fragmented nature of that binary opposition? And how do we undo or dismantle or deconstruct that opposition, even while we still acknowledge the power and importance of that text or that discourse in European thought? So that is why I said deconstruction is not destruction, but rather it is dismantling or taking apart the text to show what is the hidden ideology, or what is that hierarchical binary opposition which is at the foundation of that text, and then see what are the contradictions in that opposition and slowly dismantle the entire text. There are different methods of deconstruction, but two important methods are, first of all, revealing the undecidability of a text. This is done by analyzing all the possible themes and interpretations and pointing out contradictions within them, which in turn lead to more interpretations and more contradictions. So, what deconstructivists like Derrida say is that the text is undecidable. The meaning of a text is undecidable. There is no stable meaning, which means that there are multiple contradictory meanings that you can find in a text if you only look deep enough. So the text is undecidable, meaning is undecidable. And how do you reveal this undecidability? When you first read the text, it will seem to have an apparent meaning or an apparent set of meanings. This will be the main theme, and this will be your interpretation of that theme. But if you read the text a bit more carefully, and then you say, okay, fine, so this is the main theme, let us keep it aside and let us look at what are all the other possible themes, then you will come up with several other themes, and then you will find that once you find maybe 10 different themes or 20 different themes in that work, in that text, then you will see that some of those terms have to be contradictory to each other. But if you take any of those themes individually and you look for supporting evidence from the text or from the context around it or from other texts around it, you will be able to prove that that is the main theme. Which means that if there are 10 themes that you have discovered in this work and 5 of them are contrary opposite to the other 5, then you can actually prove that all 10 are correct, which basically means that there is some contradiction in this text. And when you point out that contradiction, this leads you to even more interpretation. You are interpreting the text by pointing out the contradictions within it. Then if you think a little further about your own interpretations, you will realize that there are contradictions in your own interpretations. So ultimately you never reach the so-called real meaning of a text, but rather you find more and more contradictory meanings and interpretations. So there is no one single meaning to any text, only interpretations. And no interpretation is coherent. No interpretation is the final interpretation. So this is the first method, deconstructing a text by revealing its undecidability. The second method is by revealing and subverting the ideology underlying a text. By identifying the dominant binary opposition invoked by the text, the element within the opposition that is privileged, the ideology behind such privileging, and then demonstrating that the reverse could also be true, thus showing the limitations of that ideology. This is very similar to what we mentioned just earlier in the earlier slide, where you take a text and then you identify what is the dominant binary opposition on which this text is based, then which is the element in that opposition which is privileged, what is the ideology that privileges element A over element B, and then you try to reverse it. You say that if this is a text that privileges man over woman, or this is a text that privileges nature over culture, let us try and find enough evidence in the text or around the text to privilege culture over nature. And to do that is not to say that the actual meaning is not nature is better than culture. The actual meaning is culture is better than nature. Angana parayanalla. That is not the point. But rather to show the limitations of the ideology that privileges nature over culture by saying that, see, even the reverse is true. You are basically again showing the contradiction within that binary opposition, within that ideology. And even if you reverse or subvert the ideology, you are not saying that the final meaning is the reversed or subverted meaning. You're just saying, see, it is possible to reverse, it is possible to subvert it, and therefore the binary opposition and the ideology underlying this text are fractured, they are contradictory, they are problematic. Now, we will look at some key concepts associated with Derrida's deconstructivist critical theory. We will look at some of these concepts in more detail in another video, but for now we will just very briefly touch upon these some 8 important concepts and try to briefly explain them. I want you to also keep in mind that these are all interrelated concepts. The first one is metaphysics of presence. According to Derrida, Western philosophical thought is based on a metaphysics of presence, which is to say that it privileges presence over absence, and all the values of Western civilization are built on this idea of presence, which is never questioned. So, for example, if you take a binary like good and evil, the very concept of good comes from the presence of certain values, and evil is the absence of those values. Derrida criticizes this metaphysics of presence by saying that if Western philosophy, by focusing on presence, has never really looked at the historical conditions or the philosophical conditions under which presence becomes possible. So, for example, you say that telling the truth is a good thing, right? Telling the truth, the presence of truth is good, and the absence of truth, which is basically almost like a falsehood, that is evil or that is bad. But in what conditions is truth a good thing? Is truth, telling the truth, always good in all conditions? And who can afford to tell the truth in all circumstances? Is there some circumstance in which truth is not possible or maybe not even desirable? So all those kind of questions are never addressed by Western philosophy, which privileges presence. So Derrida criticizes Western philosophy for being grounded in a metaphysics of presence. Another related idea is that of logocentrism. Logos is an ancient Greek word meaning the word, W-O-R-D, word, but it also can mean things like speech, thought, idea, law, rule, etc. So logocentrism is the centrality afforded to logos in terms of speech over writing, or in terms of reason and rules, laws in the Western philosophical tradition. The next term is transcendental signified. Again, this is related to the terms that have been already mentioned. Transcendental signified refers to a signified that is beyond all signifiers, a signified that is independent of all signifiers, and which stands outside and independent of all signifiers, which pre-exists all signifiers. So signifiers, they are the words that we use, and that is part of human existence. And the signified or concept, according to this traditional Western philosophical tradition, the signified, there is always some signified that stands outside human experience. Which is to say that, for example, if you take a concept like God, God pre-exists the world. Even though God is the one who supposedly created the world, it is possible for God to create the world only because He pre-exists the world. He exists outside the world, He existed before the world, and He is not governed by any of the rules that He has created to govern the world. So God governs and organizes the world, but He is not subject to the same governing and organizing principles. Now this leads us to the next concept, which is decentering. And decentering is a kind of tool that is used by deconstructivists. So if we already mentioned in our discussion of post-structuralism that structuralism believed in that everything is a structure, language is a structure, society is a structure, etc. So in a structure is a stable, coherent whole in which there are many different elements which are all held together by a center, meaning the certain rules and regulations that govern the structure. But this particular center, Derrida says, has a contradictory nature because even though it is supposed to be part of the structure and it governs all the other elements of the structure, it itself is not subject to any rules. It cannot be governed by any other element of the structure. Just like what we mentioned about God earlier. God is just one example. There are many other examples of concepts that are at the center of structures. Now, what do you do in such a situation? Derrida says that the center then has to be questioned because if it is part of the structure, then it has to be governed by the rules of that structure. If it is not governed by the rules of that structure, then it is outside the structure. Probably it is governed by some other rules. In which case, the very idea of the structure fractures. Because if there is no center, then the structure itself fractures. Or if we say that the center of this particular structure is governed by something outside the structure, then this structure is not a united whole, but rather part of something much larger. So this kind of a questioning of the idea of a unified center to a unified structure is called decentering. It can also be called displacing whatever was supposed to be at the center of a structure, displacing that away from the center. That is a process of decentering. Now, for example, in philosophy, decentering involves removing the human subject from the center. So traditionally, Western philosophy has always considered that human beings are somehow very special. They are much more privileged than animals or plants or any other element of nature or any other object in the universe. But this privileging of the human subject is also a construction. And by removing the human subject from the center and foregrounding something else like ecology, for example, or something else, we are decentering the human subject. Then the same decentering, we can look at an example from literature or literary criticism. An example for decentering in literature would be to remove the author from the central position. So when we study any text, we completely displace the author and we look at some other aspects of the text. But decentering is not just to replace one center by another. This is very important. Decentering is a process which, by displacing the central element, demonstrates that the very concept of a center has to be questioned. So if you are to replace the author with the text, for example, then you are not actually decentering. You are just creating a new center. But Deconstructivists would say that the center itself is a problematic and contradictory category and it has to be questioned. The next concept is difference. Now, difference is a neologism, a new term that is coined by Jacques Derrida. He uses two meanings of the French verb differer. Differer can mean to differ, D-I-F-F-E-R, and also to defer, D-E-F-E-R, where defer means to postpone something. So, difference is a term that Derrida comes up with in order to say that, now according to structuralists, meaning is based on difference. The meaning of a term is based on its difference from either another term in a binary opposite or from many other terms that are similar but different. So the meaning of a term is relative, it is arbitrary, and it is based on difference. Now Derrida agrees with this, but he says that meaning is not based only on difference but also on deference, postponement. Because, again, this is something that we discussed earlier in relation to post-structuralism. What Derrida says is that if you take any signifier and you look at what it signifies, what is the signified that it refers to, what is the concept that it refers to, that concept, that signified, is never an independent or whole concept. You can understand that concept only in relation to or only with reference to, only in the context of many other concepts. So, if you have listened to the previous video lesson on post-structuralism, you would remember that I was talking about Wikipedia, how when you go to Wikipedia and you look for one term, then you see many other links that will lead you to many other terms. So like that, the idea of difference says that meaning is based not only on difference but also on deference. Meaning is eternally postponed, because you cannot find the meaning of a signifier of a term in its immediate signified, because that signified will lead you to some other signified, which will lead you to some other signified, and there is only a long chain of signifiers and signifieds. The next term is aporia. Aporia is another Greek term, and aporia refers to the fault lines or the contradictions within a text or within a concept, and it is by interrogating or following those fault lines that we can destabilize and decenter and ultimately deconstruct that text. The next term is supplement. Now, Derrida talks about this term supplement with reference to or in response to something that the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau said about supplement. According to Rousseau, supplement refers to something external, something extra that is added to something. So the idea is that if I have something called A, to which I add something called B, which is a supplement. I am supplementing A by adding B. But Rousseau considered that the first object, that is A, is complete in itself, and it doesn't actually need the supplement. The supplement is external to it, it is extra, and it is just being added on. But Derrida says if something is complete by itself, then how can you add a supplement to it? The very addition of a supplement questions the fact that the initial thing to which it is added, the initial thing is not complete. So supplement then would become both something extra, something added, and also something that fulfills an original lack in the original text or the original object or the original concept. And the next term is called trace. Trace, the elements of other texts, other contexts, other discourses that are present within every text. So no text is fully present or fully absent. If you look at a text and you look only at the meaning that seems present in that text, then you will not get the full meaning of that text. Rather, every text carries within itself certain absences of other texts. So, something is present by virtue of its absence, and that is called a trace. A trace is something that is there but not actually there, something that is present but not present. So in every text there will be, so basically the idea of trace is just to say that you should look at one text not by itself but in relation to so many other texts, because even if there is no intertextuality that is visible or present, even if there is no clear reference to other texts in this text, still other texts influence this text by means of a trace, an almost invisible trace that it leaves in this particular text. So these are some of the key concepts used by Derrida and other deconstructivist theorists. And in the next video, maybe we will look at some of these texts in more, some of these concepts in a bit more detail, and then we will go on to talk about the essay by Jacques Derrida titled Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences. Thank you.